And you may be seated. This evening we're going to be studying out of the 12th book of Yisrayl. Yisrayl meaning he who rules is Yahweh. This is Menorah, and it's part 2. We're going to be covering chapter 7. The title of chapter 7 here is The Great Power of the Microorganisms is Now Sick, but it will recover, and it will obey those whom Yahweh chooses of mankind. And of course, those who Yahweh chooses of mankind will be those who overcome sin in these last days, and the previous generations of those of Yahweh's called out ones. The subtitle in this sermon, Genesis 1, verse 26, Then Yahweh said, Let my house at Abel make man in our image, according to our likeness. They will have rulership over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. And we're going to be talking tonight about some of the things that creep upon the earth, the microorganisms, and of course they're in the firmament in abundance also. I'd like to start. Now we're on page 50 of chapter 7 here, page 50. We're going to begin there. And Pastor starts out here in verse 2. He says, he's talking about something the previous speaker brought on the day he made this sermon. He said, I thought it was neat the way he tied in with this computer. The things to remember. I think we ought to, and then he says, but the things you need to remember there is the fact that Yahweh said, in the end, and this is the end, these are the end times, in the end, I'm going to increase knowledge. And Pastor says, and of course, that's the way he did it. He inspired them to build a computer as a test for Christianity. Germany had it too. They were Christians also. The fact that we accidentally bombed theirs, he's talking about their computer and their he's probably referring here though specifically about their development process of their nuclear weapons, because it says theirs were knocked out with a bomb accidentally that was hit, or they would have had the nuclear bomb because they had the computer. But all of this is done by Christianity as a test to Christianity to prove Satan is full of baloney. Her way is never going to bring peace. Here's where you find peace, right here at the great House of Yahweh, in Yahweh's great 613 laws. Now, I'd like to, regarding the increase in knowledge, I'd like to read, if you turn to the book of Daniel, where we find this prophecy, which has been fulfilled. In Daniel chapter 12, and if you look at let's start at verse 3. And those who are wise will shine as the brightness of the heavens. And this is part of the things that have been diminished now, the brightness of the heavens, the strength, the health of the firmament, the microorganisms. And it says, and those who turn many to righteousness, which is what the witness Yisrayl Abel Hawkins is doing in these last days, and members of his house who assist him in doing so, as the stars forever and ever. But you, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book to the time of the end. Many will run to and fro, and that's getting the message out in these last days, those who work in the message and promote it. Those who bring forth this message in these last days. Shut up the words, seal the book till the time of the end. Many will run to and fro, and knowledge, here's this prophecy, and knowledge will be increased. Much of this knowledge began in the middle of the 20th century, which Pastor was born in 1934, and so much of this knowledge has come forth since that time. And the computer age, the computer is it's a tool. And the information, the cell phones that are available these days are mini computers, and they can be used for righteousness or they can be used for evil. As a tool of righteousness, they can be used to communicate the message to believers. There's just many applications for the computer in these last days. So it's just like any other tool. It can be used for righteous purposes. It can be used for unrighteous purposes. And so the prophecy truly has been fulfilled that knowledge will be increased in these last days. And the computer is a major part of this increase in knowledge. It's led to a lot of technology being developed. Over on, so that's what the first thing Pastor would like us to focus on here, that knowledge will be increased in these last days. And if you go over to verse 6, it says, Pastor says, let's turn over to Revelation 18. The reason that Satan wants to destroy the microorganisms, the firmament, the earth, she knows that's how Yahweh creates things. And of course, they won't obey her. So the microorganisms will not obey Satan. Back in Genesis, we can read that she lost her ability to create flesh, but this is a part of the power, part of the authority that Yahweh wants to convey on those who overcome sin and are proven worthy. But we read here that the reason that Satan wants to destroy the microorganisms, the firmament, the earth, she knows that's how Yahweh creates things, and of course they won't obey her. She had the power of creation at one time and lost it. And I do believe that Yahweh put within these kingdoms, these microorganism kingdoms, the law that blocks anyone who sins from allowing them to be controlled. I believe that blocks their authority, and it's done automatically. He set it up to where they're bound. They're bound, and they cannot take orders from sinners. That's a great bit of information that's Pastor's bringing out here. These microorganisms, these kingdoms, cannot take orders from those who are out not keeping Yahweh's laws. And of course, when she turned to sin, Satan, lost that ability to create and maintain life, as is shown in Genesis, in the Scriptures. And then let's go down to verse 9 here. In verse 9, it says, If you start thinking, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the King James Bible, the King James Version Bible. So Pastor was brought up, he was raised on the King James Version of the Holy Scriptures. And he continues here, and the prophecy actually shows when this thing would be given again to mankind, because it was taken away from mankind. The Catholic Church tried to suppress the fact, or tried to keep the information of the Holy Scriptures, the inspired Holy Scriptures, away from mankind. She did everything within her power to withhold that information from us in these last days and from previous generations. But she wasn't successful. Yahweh did not allow her to withhold the information. So in 1934, when Pastor was born, his parents were able to read the Scripture to the children, and this is how they learned. So think about it. Without this information being available, we wouldn't have a House of Yahweh today, because this information would not have been able to have been transferred to the brothers whom Yahweh calls his two witnesses, Jacob and Yisrayl. I can hardly wait to get into that and bring this to light. It's a beautiful prophecy, and of course, it's been fulfilled. And that's the reason the House of Yahweh was established in these last days, because of a little boy with the Bible. A little oaky boy with the Bible that he loved. So this is, and this is part of the, so as a result of it, not only has the technology increased in these last days, but the knowledge of the Scriptures increased in these last days also, through the ones whom Yahweh sent to establish his house, the witnesses Jacob and Yisrayl. Over on page 11 here, And we read, and then we see that, he says in verse 1, and after these things I saw another malach come down from heaven. And Pastor says, he comments, that is, orders came down from heaven. I would that we could get these mistranslations corrected. It wasn't like a being coming down from heaven and started bringing this message. They were orders. Inspiration came from heaven, as was prophesied to be done, and as the prophet spoke under inspiration. So in these last days, the work would be brought forward again through the inspiration of Yahweh. And then in verse 12 here, verse 13, he's talking about Daniel 12 as being fulfilled. And we read Daniel 12 about knowledge increasing. Now, the last days, he said in the last days, we're going to increase knowledge, and you will have great tribulation as a result of it. The greatest tribulation ever, because we're increasing your knowledge. In building nuclear weapons and building systems for mass destruction that mankind will eventually consider a reasonable option to use these things to further their own goals. To where we can build gigantic weapons of mass destruction, and we will see what you do with it. And then in verse 14, this is... verse 2, and he cried mightily with a strong voice, Babylon the Great is fallen, and is become the habitation of demons. So this system, is prophesied to pass away. This current system of ruling governments throughout the earth is prophesied to pass away, and it's going to pass away with great tribulation. And when all the dust is settled, there's going to be a complete shifting of the authority in the earth from what it is now to Yahweh's government. It's going to take a lot of upheaval because the powers that are in the earth at this time aren't going to give up easily, I should say. They're not going to give up easily, and they're not going to want to change. So Yahweh's going to have to do a mighty work, and he's doing a mighty work in these last days to bring all these things to pass. I'm going to go over to page 52 here, and in verse 19 of this sermon, and verse 4, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people. Come out of her, my people, so that you do not partake of her sins, and so that you do not receive of her plagues. So we, in coming to the house of Yahweh, we learn Yahweh's ways, his laws, so that we can come out of this system, this sin-sick system that's throughout the earth at this time, the system that's destroying the microorganisms through the results of sin. And in verse 21 here, for her sins have reached unto heaven. And so this is a prophecy indicating that not only the earth, but the heavens, the firmament, are being affected by these sins that are in the earth at this time, this increase in sin. And Pastor comments, into the heavens, that is, into the firmament, as I showed you last week. They reached into the firmament, and the firmament is the atmosphere around that covers the earth. That's responsible for protecting us from harmful sun's rays, producing rainfall, things that without these things mankind could not live. They've reached into the firmament, and of course this is what is causing the global warming. They've got their minds blocked right now that it's caused by greenhouse gases, and I'm just adding to a little bit to what he says here. The firmament was built to take care of itself, to cleanse itself with the kingdoms of microorganisms that fill the firmament. It's totally filled with transparent kingdoms. Now they know this much. So transparent, we can't see them. We can't see the kingdoms that are out in the firmament. But recently, the information was brought out here at the House of Yahweh about a test where they gathered up, they took air samples. The scientists took air samples from the firmament, and they were amazed at the volume of microorganisms that were recovered. The different creatures microscopic, can only be seen with a microscope, microscopic creatures that they found as a result of collecting air samples. The microorganisms are getting sick, Pastor says. We showed you last week how they breed, how the viruses attack the microorganisms, how they breed them and of course reproduce. And then he talks a little bit about AIDS here. AIDS can actually reproduce itself. It's a mutation. There are mutations. But the sick kingdom can't do much, and of course that's what's taking place, and more kingdoms are becoming sick with this. They are attacked and mutated and raped, and less rain is one of the results of this. What Pastor's talking about, the microorganisms under attack, he's primarily talking about the bacteria that are being attacked by viruses. The more disease there is in the earth, the more viruses are released as a result of this process of sin being committed. And what actually occurs here, I have some information here. I'd like to read here a little bit of that, which is exactly what the process by which these bacteria are destroyed by the viruses, and in the process the viruses multiply greatly themselves. And it says here viruses that these viruses invade and kill bacterial cells. They multiply, and they do so by living on bacteria cells, which serve as a host. Now, understand that these bacteria cells are 1,000 times larger than the viruses. So you've got this somewhat helpless. If you've seen the films on this, you've seen that these bacteria almost appear to be helpless. You've got these relatively large bacteria cells compared to the viruses. They're 1,000 times larger, approximately. And then and it says here, when a virus comes in contact with a susceptible bacterial cell, it attaches to special receptor sites on the bacteria surface. This attachment is called adsorption. Generally requires certain conditions, but then it says the virus injects its own DNA into the bacteria cell. So the bacteria, they come in contact with the virus comes in contact with the bacteria cell, latches onto it, injects its DNA into this bacteria cell, and so then the DNA that's been injected into the bacteria cell begins to take over the bacteria. It kills the cell, and it becomes an incubator for hundreds of little viruses. And when the process is completed, when these viruses have grown and matured, the dead bacteria cell now bursts open and releases hundreds of these copies of the same virus that infected it in the first place. So that's the multiplication process it says, finally, the bacterial cell will lyse, L-Y-S-E, or burst, releasing dozens or even hundreds of the new virus. So basically this process, it's first, the virus coming in contact with the bacteria cell. Second part of the process is the virus latches onto it and injects its DNA. And then the bacteria becomes an unwitting virus factory. And when the virus DNA takes over the bacteria cell, these viruses grow to maturity, and then the dead bacteria cell will actually burst, releasing this hundreds of viruses to go find other bacteria cells to take over. So, and the process here goes rather rapidly. It says a typical bacteria divides every 30 minutes. At that rate, one bacteria cell will divide twice to make 4 cells in an hour. By contrast, a single virus with a burst size of 150, in other words, 150 viruses are going to be produced by that one bacteria cell that's been taken over, and the period of 30 minutes they can reproduce 22,500 virus cells. So you see that the firmament of beneficial bacteria can quickly become overwhelmed, and the more viruses you've got out there, the greater attack that the firmament is under. And so, continuing in here on the sermon here, so what is the solution to helping the firmament? Eliminating sin from the earth, eliminating the source of uncleanness, eliminating the source of defilement. Cleanliness is one of the most effective ways of protecting the beneficial bacteria. Without sin, there's less viruses produced, and so this is the solution to is cleanliness and not only physical, but the spiritual keeping of Yahweh's laws are going to protect the microorganisms that are under attack that are under a great attack right now. Another point I'd like to cover here in the first part of this, in Yochanan 8, chapter 44, Yeshua said to the Pharisees who were contending with them and claiming to be Abraham's seed, he said, "You are of your teacher, who is Satan, the devil." And Pastor says, we'll be showing that again if you read in Revelations, and whatever, and Yeshua continued, whatsoever she who is your teacher desires, you will do. And then Pastor comments here, and one of the major points in his sermon, he says, Satan is working full time with people to bring forth lies, hoping to pull you, all of us, out of Yahweh's work of enlightenment. In other words, teaching the laws. The only place on the face of the earth that's enlightening the world with this great message of Yahweh, and she's trying to pull you out to stop this work from taking place. So we always need to be aware of that the adversary is against us and trying to destroy us with, her influences. And Yeshua continued here in Matithia, or in Yochanan chapter 8, she was a murderer from the beginning, speaking of the adversary, and remained not in the truth, because there is no truth in her. She is a liar. She is a liar and the teacher of lies. Yet, because I, Yeshua, he's speaking to the Pharisees, tell you the truth, you do not believe me. Which of you convicts me of sin? They could not convict Yeshua of sin because he overcame. He never did commit sin. He was sinless, blameless, and so he qualified to be our perfect atonement. Which of you convicts me of sin? So if I speak the truth, will you not believe me? He who is of Yahweh hears Yahweh's words. The law and the prophets, remember Isaiah 8 verse 20 says, to the law and the prophets, if they speak not according to these, the law and the prophets, there is no light in them. So that's a sure indication that you want to avoid that type of person who speaks not of the laws and the prophets. Now do you not hear? Now you do not hear, because you are not of Yahweh, Yeshua said to them. I'm going to go over to verse 38 here. Well, back to the firmament, Pastor says. We ended last week with, and I believe it was Matithia 23, where Yeshua actually spoke to the wind. That was Matthew 8, verse 23 to 27, where Yeshua actually spoke to the wind, and this is where we find out this and other places that the wind can hear. The wind can hear. Now that's quite an understanding that the wind can hear. Of course, if it's filled with microorganisms, kingdoms, like Pastor says, trillions of kingdoms of microorganisms, the wind can hear. The wind heard the words of Yeshua, and the wind can obey. In verse 39 here, in Eob's day, Satan could bring forth storms. And if you read in Eob, part of the testing, Yahweh allowed Satan to bring storms against his dwellings, against cattle in his fields, and things like this. So Satan could bring forth storms. Now, and she did this. Pastor says, I would say that she made a bunch of microorganisms sick at that time to bring forth these storms that took place, because the wind no longer obeys her. None of the microorganisms obey Satan anymore. Otherwise, she would have the power to create. That's how Yahweh puts you together in one day, how he built the earth in one day. He merely commanded it. He merely commanded that the earth be assembled, created in a day. And that's what we read last week. We see in Genesis 1:28, this is his authority that he wants to give to man. But what are the requirements? What does Yahweh require of us before he would give us that authority, before he would give mankind that authority? If you look at in Revelation chapter 5 and verse 12, Revelation 5 and verse 12. Revelation 5 and verse 12, it reads, saying with a loud voice, worthy is the Lamb, and of course the Lamb being spoken of here is our high priest Yeshua, who was slain. He fulfilled the prophecy of becoming our high priest, our atonement, our perfect sacrifice, who was slain. So worthy is the Lamb to receive power. And notice that these are some of the blessings that those who overcome and who Yeshua will recognize that is coming, who was slain to receive power, riches, wisdom, strength, honor, glory, and blessings. So these are some of the things that Yahweh has promised to mankind. He's giving them to Yeshua. He's saying he's worthy to receive them because he did not commit sin, the first to do so. So this is some of that great authority that Yahweh has promised for us. Here in verse 41, in Hebrews 11, verse 3, Pastor talks a little bit about the faith. He says, now the faith, and then he defines what the faith is, what's being spoken of here in Hebrews chapter 11. And he says the faith is the whole system, the whole plan of salvation for mankind. That's the faith that was given. So that's what we're learning here at the House of Yahweh. That's what the prophets of old understood and taught. That's what Moshe taught under inspiration from Yahweh to the children of Israel. The whole system, the whole plan of salvation for mankind, the faith that is given. And so Hebrews 11 verse 1, now the faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. No, we can't see all the great things Yahweh has in store for those who overcome. Verse 2, for by this the men of old obtained a righteous report. The same thing we're trying to do ourselves is to obtain a righteous report, and we're doing so here in the great house of Yahweh, sitting at the feet of Yahweh's witness, Yisrayl Abel Hawkins. Verse 3, through this, the faith, we understand that the worlds were formed, and now we know more about how the world was formed by the command of Yahweh using microorganisms, and we understand that the worlds were formed by the command of Yahweh. By the command, the word, the command of Yahweh, and the worlds were formed in one day. And the pastor continues with the microorganisms here. He's talking about some of the references to global warming. Then down here he says, they don't understand it about the microorganisms. In other words, the world doesn't understand about the microorganisms. They don't understand the firmament, what it's made out of, how Yahweh can use it and actually command it to do a certain thing, and it does it. So the things, continuing in Hebrews 11 here, so the things which were not in evidence are now seen coming to pass. So a lot of these things weren't understood. The number of microorganism kingdoms in the firmament never was understood. It's only in these last days, as knowledge is increased, and pastor teaching them about these kingdoms, that they're starting to do studies and collect their samples, and they're amazed at these microorganism kingdoms. They don't believe this either. This is verse 51, that the Savior here's the power that this man has because he had received the authority that was promised to the sons of men. This promise is to the sons of men, not to the Malachim. His promise is to the sons of men. I'll make man in my image, after my likeness, and I will give him authority. I'm fully convinced we don't understand what this all is involved in, this authority that Yahweh has planned and wants to give to the sons of men. What would you think if you were standing on the side of a lake and you could tell a fish with words, go get a coin down there at the bottom of the lake and bring it here to me and get on my hook. I have the hook waiting for you. Well, this is what Yeshua did, and in verse 52, Matthew 17, verse 26, Kepha answered Yeshua and said to him, for strangers, Yeshua had asked him a question. Yeshua said to him, then the children are free. So Yeshua was saying, well, but then he said in verse 27, he said, however, so that we may not offend them, go to the sea, cast a hook, and take the fish that comes up first. Now, how could Yeshua predict this? Well, he caused it to occur by, as Pastor taught us, speaking to the fish or speaking to the microorganisms that control the fish. But he had the authority, because he was without sin, to do this commanding. When you have opened its mouth, you will find a piece of money equal to 1 full shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and you, not to pay their taxes that they were requiring them to pay. Now, down in verse 54 here, Pastor says, now the scientists know how the bacteria talk to each other. We just saw a film on that last week, and there was a film presented here in the sanctuary that showed scientific an experiment that proved that the microorganisms were able to communicate to one another. They're not just individuals, they're kingdoms. They work together to produce a result. So we know that they know that the bacteria can actually communicate with each other. The scriptures show that they can also hear and take instruction from the one who has this authority. That's given in Genesis 1 verse 26. Yeshua was given this authority from Yahweh, to where he will be honored by the kingdoms, the microorganism kingdoms, who will fill the earth, who creep in the earth and fill the firmament that is above the earth. And Pastor continues here, well, we saw that last week in the film, and I hope you remember it, how they attack the bacteria and attack it, how they rape it. And what he's referring to is the viruses latching onto the bacteria, seeking out a bacteria cell, latching onto these receptor sites, injecting their DNA, and the DNA takes over the bacteria, kills it, and becomes a factory for viruses. And that's what Pastor's talking about here. How they mutate it. Once they rape it, the mutation comes from this bacteria, whatever the bacteria are, whatever the viruses are. If it's HIV in the bacteria, you'll have half this and half that. Whatever the bacteria, it's different. Whatever the virus that caused that attack, and they're creating trillions after trillions of these. They multiply rapidly, and I gave you the information here how in one hour these viruses can multiply 22,000 fold. One virus can multiply to 22,000. Whereas the bacteria, they can only multiply from 1 to 4 because they split once every 30 minutes. So 4 bacteria versus 22,000 viruses. So if you have a high number of viruses in the firmament, you're going to have massive attack on the bacteria in the firmament. And of course, Pastor continues, bacteria multiply rapidly. Well, the virus multiply much quicker than the bacteria do. But given time and increase of time and increase, you see what is taking place today with our firmament getting sick and unable to operate like Yahweh designed it to operate. And then there's an interest here in verse 58. Pastor goes into an interesting point about Psalm 104, verse 26. Psalm 104, verse 26 reads, "There the ships sail about, and you, Yahweh, formed the Leviathan to play there." Okay? Well, this word Leviathan, very interesting word, and the commentators translate this to be dragons and serpents, some beastly beast. Dragons and serpents, they call it Leviathan. But in verse 59 here, Pastor explains what it really is. Leviathan comes from a Hebrew word that means organisms in mourning. In other words, organisms that are crying out for help. Organisms that are crying out for relief. Organisms in mourning. It's microorganisms, Pastor proclaims here. And they're in mourning. They're in mourning. They mourn and they're fading away. That's what's taking place in the firmament. That's what this word actually means. It means organisms in mourning. And verse 60 here, he says, we have powerful telescopes and also powerful microscopes. In fact, some of the telescopes that are out there, not to change the subject, but some of the telescopes, these increase in knowledge telescopes that are out in space now, taking pictures of these far-flung galaxies, are finding incredible things. A news article recently said that they're predicting that almost every star out there that's a sun-type star, has at least one planet that's associated with it. And but continuing here, we have powerful telescopes now. We even have, better than that, we have computerized microscopes that can actually magnify and correct pictures 400,000 times bigger, where they can actually see these microorganisms, and they still haven't found all of them. And then Pastor goes into Isaiah chapter 24 here, And Isaiah chapter 24 is, you're probably very familiar with verses 1 through 6, and so he's going into part of that here. But in verse 18 he says, the foundations of the earth are going to be shaken. So all aspects of the earth in these last days is being shaken by the results of sin, including the microorganisms. And verse 20 says the earth is going to reel to and fro. And on the top of page 55 here, Pastor says, he will take the ones that choose his righteousness, he will give them authority. And we read about just a small bit of the authority that's spoken of in Revelations 5 verse 12. Authority, and with that authority they're going to restore the earth to its origin, to the original condition. They will restore life to eternal life. Now, the end result will be no more death, as Pastor referred to in a recent sermon. No more death. They will restore life to eternal life, where man will never die again. No more tears. No more tears, as it states in Revelation. They will restore the universe back to its origin and stop the wars. With the very tiniest creatures that Yahweh formed, that no one would ever think that he uses, and have great power because they obey his voice, and will obey your voice one day. In verse 2, and it will be, this is Isaiah chapter 24, verse 2, and it will be as with the people, so with the priest. It's going to be with everyone. No one is going to be excluded from participating in these end days, whether they're sheltered in the highest mountain or dug in the deepest underground bunker. Everyone will experience the full force of the tribulation in these last days. It will be as with the people, so with the priest. The land will be utterly emptied, utterly plundered, for Yahweh has spoken this word. And we know that when Yahweh speaks, there are results. There are results. The prophecies will be and are being fulfilled. Verse 4, the earth mourns. Well, this is what this Leviathan means. It means microorganisms in mourning. The earth mourns and fades away. Actually, we see some other words here, and let me see if I can get that correction. Okay, and then it goes on to Isaiah 24 here. And this is another main point that Pastor's making in this sermon. He says the earth, in this clause, the earth mourns and fades away. Isaiah 24 verse 4 is translated from the Hebrew word aratz. This word is listed on page 153 of the Hebrew and Chaldean lexicon of the Old Testament, and it means universe. So it's just not the ground, it's the earth and the atmosphere around it. Well, universe is made up of microorganisms, kingdoms of microorganisms, other beings too, but they are all moving together and making planets and so forth. Whatever Yahweh tells them to form, that's what they form. So, think of the great power, that authority, power, responsibility. Let's call it responsibility rather than authority. The great authority that Yahweh has, which He's given to Yeshua, is qualified, and He wants to give to the called out ones that same authority. The word people in verse 4 means the inhabitants of the earth. And the word languish means to be sick. And so the people of the earth languish at this time. Sin has reached its peak, and so people are suffering, and they probably don't quite understand why they're suffering as much as they are. Sick in body, sick in mind, as we see with the school shootings and everything that are going out there. The lack of self-control, the rage, for the unexplained rage, the negative influences in the media, in television, in the movies, and video games, all of this, and the unclean foods, all of this is combining to, as Yahweh prophesied it would, that the people of the earth languish. Means to be sick. It means to be sick. The universe mourns and fades away. The world mourns and fades away. All of them getting sick. The microorganisms in the body are getting sick and dying. And of course, by this, you are dying. Your body is dying. Well, we in the House of Yahweh know what we need. We're being taught how to maintain a healthy body. Eating clean foods, keeping the laws of Yahweh, all of these things we're being blessed here in the great House of Yahweh. And the dwellers of the firmament and the inhabitants of the earth have become sick and need peace. I'm going to turn over to page 56 here. So then Pastor goes on in verse 70. He talks about Hebrews chapter 4 shows that the microorganisms are in mourning because, as Isaiah 24:5 says, the earth is defiled. The earth, that is also, it also means universe there. The universe is defiled by the inhabitants of it. It's because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, and broken the everlasting covenant. I'd like to go back a little bit to this article here that talked about the process where the viruses attack the bacteria and kill them and replicate themselves, the viruses. Just like to indicate, this article was written by a food scientist who noticed this process, that of how it operated, and it does affect some food processes. But he said he was talking about how to minimize the effect that viruses have on bacteria. And he said sanitation is also important. Equipment should be clean, sanitized, floors kept clean and dry to lessen the transport of viruses on boots and shoes. He's talking about food plant operation here now. And he's talking about, he says, personnel play a significant role in contamination control. Now, he's talking about with respect to the control of viruses in a food environment, okay? But think of everything we're taught here in the House of Yahweh about cleanliness, about clean body, clean mind, just maintaining cleanliness. It says personnel play a significant role in contamination control. It is critical that they properly sanitize before entering, the food processing facility here. But then they talk about, just keeping everything clean, just keeping everything clean, and is beneficial in controlling the spread of viruses. I had the opportunity once to talk to an engineer who was the chief engineer in a large food processing facility, and one comment he made is, see, this food processing building, it was huge. It was acres, several acres under one roof, manufacturing food. But he said, I never get sick. And what he was referring to was whenever he went from one area of the food processing plant to another, he had to wash his hands. Okay? Now, that may not seem like much to us, but it is important. He said, I never get sick. I'm always washing my hands. I wash my hands 12, 15 times a day. And he claims that this had an effect on because he's always washing the dirt off of his hands, so it wasn't going in his eyes or his mouth and that type of thing. So, it is important when we're exhorted to wash our hands, maintain personal cleanliness. That is important. That's an important thing. On verse 71 here, that's another point that Pastor wants us to be aware of. He says, "Now you should be willing to give Yahweh glory and honor Him by coming out of her and being separate and not partaking in sin." So I'd like to read that again. Now we should be willing to give Yahweh glory here and honor Him by coming out of her and being separate and not partaking in sin. I'd like you to turn, if you have your books of Yahweh, to Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 26. Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 26. "For such a high priest is fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and made higher than the heavens." So, when Yeshua returns, He's going to return apart from sin. He's going to, So that's why it's important that we overcome sin, that we put it behind us. Because when Yeshua comes, He's going to look for those who are His, those who have followed His example. And as Pastor says here, you should be willing to give Yahweh glory here and honor Him by coming out of her and becoming separate and not partaking of sin. Verse 72 here, he says, "The organism, an organism is anything, any living thing." So the definition of organism is any living thing, whether it's small or large. We think of the microorganisms as being microscopic. They are. But it's any living thing, no matter how small or how large. And Pastor says, well, you needed the one sent. Yes, we need Pastor Yisrayl Abel Hawkins to teach us these things, to write these books. This is the 12th book of Israel from the year 2012, his sermons. And he says here, 2 cents worth, the 2 witnesses worth. So he's referring to his brother also here. Remember that too, and if they speak not according to the law and the prophets, they are full of lies. So it's easy for us to understand, to identify who's teaching the truth and who's teaching according to, the more we learn about the laws and the prophecies, the more we can, the more we know the truth. They are the truth. In Genesis 7 verse 21, "And all flesh died that lived on the earth." And this is speaking of the flood. "Birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing." Get that? Pastor says, every creeping thing. Here's your microorganisms in the earth. So the microorganisms, they're in the earth. They're in the soil. In fact, some of the most fertile soil is just abundant with microorganisms. It's abundant with worms and other creatures that break down the organic matter, which is the plant life, in the soil. One thing I've noticed since I was a young man growing up on the farm, back then when my dad, he had to do a lot of cultivating to get rid of the weeds. He'd go over his land with a cultivator 3-4 times in the spring of the year, and by the time he usually got to cultivating the land, the weeds had grown up. So it took some effort to cultivate them all under, and so that he could plant his seed and get control. The purpose being to control the weeds, so the weeds didn't overtake the crop. Well, today the farming methods are completely different. Today, you don't see a field very seldom anymore that has any weeds in it. Why? Because of all the chemicals that have been sprayed on that field in previous years. They're basically barren. And so the way they're farming the land that my dad farmed 50, 60, 70 years ago. The way they're farming that today, it's basically maybe 2 passes. One pass with the agricultural equipment to do some cultivating with the first piece of equipment. And actually, they don't even do any cultivating. They just chisel a furrow and drop the seed right in the furrow. So it's basically no-till. And then, so how do they control the weed? It's all done with chemicals. It's all done with, they start with Roundup Ready seeds, which means that you can spray those plants. They've got the Roundup resistant gene in them, so you can spray those plants with Roundup Ready chemicals. It'll kill everything except the plant. Everything except the corn plant, everything except the soybean plant, and they're trying to add other things to it. But those are the 2 main crops. But you know what? You know what occurs? Not all of that Roundup is used to kill the plant, to kill the weeds. Some of it ends up in the corn. Some of it ends up in the soybean. And guess what? Where does it end up next? In our digestive system, in our stomach, in our large intestine, small intestine. And guess what? It hurts us just a little bit, but it's part of the defilement of the earth that we're experiencing right now. Pastor said, 30 years ago, he said that Satan was going to try to destroy the food supply. And she has. She has destroyed it. She hasn't completely destroyed it, but she's sure working very hard, and she's made some impressive gains in just the time that I've been in the House of Yahweh, sitting at the feet of Yisrayl Abel Hawkins. She's made some impressive gains, and it's part of the end result right now, where the people of the earth are sick. That's part of it. They eat unclean foods. And even some of the clean foods are not totally beneficial. So that's just the system that the adversary has created. And that's the system that's going to be turned over. It's going to, within these last days, very shortly now, this system is going to undergo a giant reset. A giant reset. It's going to take a little while, but it's going to undergo a giant reset from what we have today to Yahweh ruling in the earth through our high priest Yeshua and those who overcome sin. So, Pastor's continuing here. He says, and there is a study here, toward the end of his sermon here, he references the robustness of microorganisms. They're tough, but they're under great attack in these last days. He's reading an article here. It says, the robustness of microorganisms against physical extremes such as temperature, pH, which is acidity, alkalinity, that type of thing, pressure, and radiation is well known. It's well known that they can survive in the test that they're shown here. And then that he was referencing an article in National Geographic here that microorganisms are actually very robust, although the attacks upon them are very extreme right now. In verse 85 here, well, this is what Yahweh made, of course, and it can survive, Pastor is saying, but it also gets sick, and we've seen this sickness taking place due to the sins of man and the raping of these cells by different viruses that mankind himself has created. So this is, this is wonderful information that Pastor's brought out here on the microorganisms, and I believe he has some sermons that follow up on this. So what are we to do? Follow the teachings of Yahweh's witness in these last days. Never sin again. Do what we can to build up the house of Yahweh. Serve and serve more abundantly. and endure until the end.